Hello and welcome back to the Advancing Healthcare Innovation Show. I am your host, Michael Stamatinos. It is amazing to be with you, and we're super excited to be here. You know why? Because we are having some really incredible discussions with leaders that are painstakingly shaping the future of healthcare. And we're really passionate around leadership, access to care, and a number of other different initiatives. And if it's your first time tuning in, let me just sort of take a step back and tell you what we're trying to do here. But before I do that, make sure you hit the subscribe button now so that any of the new interviews and conversations come right to your inbox. So we're a healthcare innovation company. We're focused on bringing real stories of innovation to life, not just the stuff that you read about in headlines, but people that are really doing the work and hearing about what it means. And what does it mean to look like when things don't go right or when things do go right? We want to know about those things. And as part of our commitment to keeping you updated with the latest advancements and solutions that are happening within our niche, we've got a pretty innovative leader who's pushing the boundaries and shaking things up in the industry. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce our next guest on the show. We're delighted to have an industry professional whose expertise combines two things. It combines medical simulation and professional education for healthcare professionals. So meet Howard Fried. He's currently spearheading strategic partnerships in professional affairs at Vantari VR. So Howard has an amazing knack for engaging with top-notch professionals across medical societies and medical device companies globally, making sure that the projects that he's involved with help doctors, nurses, and clinicians do their jobs better. And Vantari's really cool VR, it's changing the dynamic and the way people in healthcare learn. So Howard isn't just sort of an innovation maestro. He's really a people person. He's the connector. He's fostering collaborative relationships across numerous stakeholders. And now we get the opportunity to sort of learn about some of the stuff that he's been working on. So Howard, it's so nice to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so let's dig in a little bit of your background, your tours of duty. How do you sort of land within this space, this conundrum of like educating high level professionals while doing it sort of in an innovative way?
So my background that's kind of brought me to this point has been a little bit diverse. I've had the pleasure of working in everything from clinical research to then working in Salesforce development, still within the healthcare domain, working heavily with pharmaceutical companies. And then an opportunity arose to join CAE when they got into the healthcare space back in 2010, initially as a product owner, helping define a roadmap and evolve some surgical simulators for laparoscopy and endoscopy, and then starting to engage more with both key societies and a lot of the leading medical device manufacturers to ensure that the procedures that we wanted to develop included the equipment that they were working tirelessly on and at very high levels of investment to make sure we always had the latest technology integrated to really allow those delivering the care to do it with the most advanced technologies wherever possible. And that kind of evolved. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of startups now. So both hands-on simulators, virtual simulators using nothing more than your mobile phone, and most recently joining a startup named Vantari out of Australia, where I've had this great opportunity. In fact, it marked a year on Friday, where it's
Happy
allowed me.
anniversary.
Thank you so much. It's allowed me to kind of continue in that foray, still engaging medical specialists, key societies, and medical device partners to help them deliver the best training possible to ensure that patient outcomes can be impacted in a positive way and leading technologies can be adopted safely to perform those interventions.
That's brilliant. So think about, when you first started, um, from an innovation standpoint, how did people learn, when you sort of first were kind of engaging within this sphere? And then what does that transition look like today? Like where really has the gap been?
So when I first started in the medical simulation space specifically, it was back in 2010, and the focus was more on two different types or three different types of training opportunities. One was that the legacy method, which is still used and relied on heavily around the world, the Halstead model of see one, do one, teach one, which has a number of challenges that come with it. And then there was the evolution and the adoption of other forms of simulation. So that included some of your basic task trainers, so physical models that you can interact on rather than doing that on a patient on various parts of their anatomy. It evolved to have maybe more embedded technology, maybe some cameras in some of those task
Mm.
trainers to learn about your economy of movement and to give you some basic metrics. And then it started to evolve. And so my joining CAE was allowed me to get my hands on what were referred to as VR simulators, but they weren't virtual reality simulators as we currently know them with your, your Meta Quest headsets, etc.
Yeah.
They were more larger size and footprint simulators where you had replicas of real equipment, whether they be laparoscopic instrumentation, endoscopes, and you then inserted them into a larger box and used haptic force feedback or the simulated sense of touch to try to allow you to interact with the anatomies of the patient you want to perform interventions on. I think these all offered very nice levels of fidelity as
Mhm.
the technology permitted at the time. There were
Right.
challenges as well, things like portability, scalability, in a lot of cases, affordability. But as the technology advanced, there were some very interesting initiatives where those kind of platforms actually played an important role and still do to this day, whether it be the use of a basic box trainer in something called the fundamentals of laparoscopic surgery, which has part of my familial connection to it. My father had worked on that, so I was introduced to simulation very early on. And then that was adopted by a major US surgical society called SAGES. It was adopted by the American Board of Surgery as well as a
Mm.
credential that residents and fellows had to pass in order to get their license. That then extended even into endoscopy using more of the VR physical like system, something that SAGES had developed with a company called Symbionics at
Mhm.
the time. Now they're part of surgical science. So that kind of showed through validation and a lot of iteration how the different levels of fidelity could be introduced into more of high stakes credentialing as well. And now we're at a point where while those platforms are still very important at
Right.
different points of the learning curve of the end user, this rapid evolution of things like virtual reality from a headset perspective. So when you talk about scale and affordability, anybody can go pick this up at your local consumer electronics store,
Well,
and it
let's talk
allows.
about that
Yeah.
because we're about access. So
Mhm.
beforehand, before you mentioned about affordability and accessibility, what was an investment like, prior to this type of a new emerging type of a methodology? And
Absolutely. So
what's it like today? I mean, what are we talking about here?
yeah, so I mean, you had something like the FLS box trainer, which was just to practice the general principles that you need to be proficient at in laparoscopic surgery. It was about a $1,500 or so plastic box with some consumables you would put in and use your real instrumentation. So I
Hmm.
would say portable and affordable, and it really was built to serve that purpose on those basic skills. When you moved over to some of these larger VR platforms, like I mentioned, whether it was from CAE,
No.
Vertimed, Surgical Science, Symbionics, and there are a number of other companies. Those were now much bigger in size, maybe in some cases a few £100s. They were not easily shipped. They had to go into rather large road cases, expensive to ship around. So the trainee still really had to come to the training location in order to access it. So, and those
Right.
larger platforms might be in the $100,000 plus range. And then they go up from there based on the modules you want to subscribe to, service plans, etc. So again, they serve their purpose, but you needed to go to the training versus bringing the training to you. What these new types of platforms have introduced, like what we're using at Vantari, which is the Meta Quest, is something that could cost sub $500, and I say 500 with the latest
Right.
version that they just released. You could throw it in your backpack. We call it a hospital to go, and you can really take it anytime, anywhere. So the notion of just-in-time training has become much more accessible, whether that be in North America or in your developing markets where they may not always have access to the same equipment, faculty, and maybe the volume of cases that we would see here in North America or Western Europe. So the technology now allowed, especially the graphics and the processing, allowed you to recreate immersive environments that looked much more realistic than they had in prior years. The behavior of the equipment is much more true to life. And now
Right.
you can have the different components that you'd have to rely on within these larger training facilities. So if you can imagine, instead of having to send a resident, a fellow, maybe a med student down to the simulation center in the basement of the hospital, if it is on within the hospital and
Right.
not somewhere
Right.
else on campus, now you can have this located in the physician's lounge or right outside the ICU, the OR, So if you only had 15 minutes between cases, you could throw on the headset, log in, and practice a procedure a few times before going back into your clinical rotation. So it has become that much more accessible. And if you look at, like I mentioned, the developing markets, it's much easier for now an instructor to go there to train on the procedural workflow of, let's say, putting in a chest drain or doing a surgical airway,
Right.
and then saying for a very low investment, you can acquire a number of these headsets. All you really need is power to plug into. And you have that ability to have your learners practice according to the guidelines that have become adopted here in North America and Western Europe, and also access to a lot of the clinical supplies that they just wouldn't have spares of in a lot of cases because they need to use those pieces of equipment for actual delivery of care, not
Right.
for practice.
And this is specifically for surgeons, or what about like some of the other ancillary team? Because when you think about it in an operating environment, it's very team oriented. It isn't just a surgeon; it's the circulating nurse and other nurses and technicians. What type of training does the supporting cast get in relation to this, or is that something that's not included in something like this?
So, while I spoke about some of these other platforms, those physical simulators, a lot of
Yeah.
that was specific to surgeons and surgeons, endoscopists, thoracic surgeons, etc. But we can't forget where really a lot of the simulation started, which was decades ago. And if anybody has ever taken a CPR course, for example, they're definitely familiar with Laerdal's Resuscitate Annie, which is probably the most deployed of
Hmm.
any type of simulator in the world that allows you to do chest compressions and measure if you're doing it to the right depth and frequency, etc. So there are a plethora of different types of simulators out there, depending on who your end user is, whether that be nursing students, which often seem to be one of the larger consumers of mannequin-based education, to task trainers. So it might be, how do you clean a wound or do some basic suturing? How do you change or put in an IV line if you're in nursing? There's also communication simulators that allow you to take a patient history, to communicate bad information or sad information to the patient, to kind of focus not only on the cognitive and the technical, but the emotional side of delivery of healthcare as well. So those have really all evolved, and there are different levels of immersiveness that's required for different levels of learners at different stages of their training. So I
Right.
think that VR just being one of the maybe more recent ones, with a lot of promise being pinned on new technologies like the Apple Vision Pro, the
Right.
Lenovo VRX, and other platforms out there. At Vantari, we've been focusing on 4 specialty areas with specific intent. So we're focusing on emergency medicine, critical care, so intensive care, critical care, anesthesia, and cardiology, mostly geared, I would say, for the resident and the fellow. And we've chosen that because of a number of factors. One is there's often a lot of specialty overlap between, for example, in Europe, it's very common to be an anesthetist and a critical care physician or ED physician. Same thing here in North America as well. We've developed a lot of intellectual property around ultrasound guided procedures. So there's been all this talk over many years now how the ultrasound probe will become the stethoscope of the future. Why listen and have to interpret when you can see and have evidence of what you might be expecting or not expecting, and rule that out right at the point of care rather than referring a patient. There's a backlog. Maybe the patient further falls into a negative state of health and compounding health events because of the time delay in that diagnosis and intervention. So we've developed more that allows us to offer these types of training, focusing on the procedure training side, not the task, but the full length procedures, leveraging a lot of these technologies. And now from the device manufacturers, they have really—
Well, hold on a sec, because one of the things that I think about as you were kind of going through that sequence of thoughts is, we're going through well, we've been going through it. There's challenges in the workforce, and I've had numerous conversations with perioperative leaders that are saying, "Hey, listen, our number one kind of priority here is that we want to take travelers nurses and reduce that number down significantly." But then when you think about it, okay, well, maybe they take their existing pool of nurses locally and they leverage some of them. Maybe there's some deficits in sort of skills. What are they doing to kind of mitigate that? Is that sort of a good use case in terms of leveraging VR in that standpoint to really orientate those that are coming into those types of environments to get up to speed, to get the reps, so they're not going into it completely cold.
Absolutely. And so you raise a really good point. You know, when you talk about nursing, there's a global shortage of nurses. It's not scalable, it's not sustainable to be constantly flying them in from shared resource pools, or in some regions, they would entice them with very large contracts. But the truth is, they would stay for a year or two and they would kind of make their money and move on. So they would, even in countries that had deeper pockets historically, they still face that challenge. And I've seen it firsthand with large new cohorts coming in, being trained, and people telling me probably half of them won't be here in a year and a half or 2 years because they're going to make some money. They'll go home and they'll find a job now closer to home. So the use of platforms like VR really help close that gap. Not necessarily insofar as, because we're not necessarily as focused on training of nurses. However, nurses, as I've come to appreciate being a father, when I saw how much work, in fact, I'd say the majority during my wife's delivery was performed by the nurse, the ability to inform them as what is the environment that they may be asked to go into? What is the equipment they're going to be asked to be familiar with and understand when the right instruments are used at the right steps of the procedure? Not only in a good outcome, but in scenarios where things sometimes go wrong. And that's not necessarily the fault of the operator, but necessarily sometimes it's the patient just had an unknown condition that we didn't know until we touched that piece of tissue, and it was necrotic and it fell apart, but we didn't know that until we literally went to grasp it. So now how do we stem the bleeding more quickly? So by offering these vehicles like VR that would allow a nurse to take themselves through the whole procedure as if they're the physician, not because they're going to perform it, but that way they understand what is the physician going to be doing next, what instrument may he or she want to ask for, so I'm not searching around and now
Right.
frustrating them, especially in conditions where time is of the
Hmm.
essence. You know, when I say I need, that cautery device because I need to stop the bleeding immediately, you don't want the
Mm.
nurse looking around and the physician being upset, reaching over, etc. So it allows them to learn at their own pace, their own time. You know, there are often, in a lot of cases in the US, but elsewhere, these limitations on number of hours you can be in the hospital
Yeah.
setting as a student. So how do you then backfill that? Not only because of the critical information that they need to be aware of and skilled up on, but also to make it enjoyable. You want them to want to learn more, as the education paradigm shifts more to proficiency and competency-based education. Those who are more eager and motivated, why not afford them the opportunity to leverage all these great technologies to get ahead, to push themselves? And if they can do that from their living room, and all they need
Yeah.
access to is something that they can maybe check out from the simulation center or borrow from the program director at the hospital, whether that be the nursing program director or elsewhere, otherwise, I think is beneficial to all of us as prospective patients, again, in a way that is still scalable, affordable, and portable.
You know, it, you've mentioned so many of the benefits, but I can't help but think, what is it that would cause someone to have reservations about deploying this?
So I think there's a number of things that I want to say challenges or objections that sometimes are common that have to be
Yeah.
handled. On one hand, there's a level of fidelity expectation. And while I believe the graphics, the capabilities of VR companies like Vantari to put the user in a very immersive environment is now here. So I think that box can be checked. But when it comes to the handling of the equipment, there will always have to be some level of trade-off. And what is it that you want to get out of the experience? So for example, when we look at the Oculus or other types of equipment, you have handles. In the case of the Meta handles, they actually can vibrate. And at Ventari, we've built our own engine to allow us to fine tune that level of vibration, its intensity, its frequency, to as closely as possible mimic what does that sense of touch feel like when you're inserting a guide wire and it's going up over the arch and there's some resistance, or you need to make an incision and then put your finger in to explore the space. So I think on some hand, we're able to achieve that very nicely. I think because the graphics have come a long way, you can kind of cheat the brain into feeling things that you may not actually be feeling through the handles, but the level of
Right.
detail is there, whether it's
Right.
tissue that's dimpling or tenting if you're pulling on it. You start to see that, and your brain's telling you you're feeling it, even if you're not tactily feeling it. I think that and the the evolution has been such that other vehicles for training that had been the norm forever, that offer the highest level of fidelities, just aren't as both acceptable ethically and accessible at the same time. So you look at things like cadaver labs.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. If you can access one, you need to have special facilities. They can only be preserved or embalmed for so long. I had the fortune of going to South Africa with one of our device partners a few years ago, and I was taken into a room where there were maybe over 100 cadavers. They had used those cadavers for almost a year with different cohorts of learners coming through. You can only dissect tissue and different pieces of anatomy so many times before you're not really gaining anything from it, versus what it was intended to do.
Yeah.
Then beyond that, you also had animal models. So for the longest time, the highest level of fidelity, if you were practicing surgery or vascular devices and all that, was with an anesthetized pig. Well, that also offers certain challenges, special environments. Obviously, the animal rights activists, rightfully so, have concerns over that. So you have to, in some cases, have sites more in secret so they don't know where those labs and facilities are. You have certain regions where pigs are not just permissible to be used. So what are your alternatives? And then disposing of them, you need to have special areas to prepare them, to dispose afterwards. And it's very expensive, and it's just not scalable. And in a lot of cases, whether it was the US government on the DoD side just a few years ago said, we're doing away with animal models. So what are those alternatives? There are some companies and technologies that have developed kind of synthetic cadavers. There are a number of excellent companies that have synthetic body parts so that you can do certain interventions, and the tissue does feel, I would say, quasi-lifelike. There are pumps you can connect to some of those synthetic cadavers to have blood flow going so you can practice. But again, they're expensive to set them. They're messy in a lot of cases. So these are often some of the preconceived notions that we have to overcome in the VR industry, is to put them in the headset. And while I can connect this and share this over a Zoom, and you might say it looks really good, until you put it on, it's hard to fully experience it. So there is a travel cost, if you will. Whenever there is a party that is showing some level of interest, it's very important to us to get in front of them to say, it's one thing for me to show it. I want you to experience it, because the nature of the technology is purely experiential. And that allows us to address any concerns and reservations about tactile feedback. Let me put you in the chest drain module. And why don't you put your finger into the incision you just made and feel around in the pleural space? And I've had the fortune of collaborating last summer with a medical student who took home the headset, lent to him by the simulation center. He trained himself on how to do a chest drain, and then had the fortune of shadowing in the ED department when that had to be performed. And they allowed him to do that step where he's able to put his finger in. And he called me and he said, it felt just like it did in VR. And the attending physicians were like, how are you so knowledgeable about this workflow? And he said, let me walk you through the workflow, even though you're doing it, only to then share with them that he learned this by using VR. Now, he cautioned at the same time, it's not the magic bullet that will replace all training.
Right.
But he didn't have to bother faculty. He could do it on his own time outside of his other studies and clinical rotations. He didn't need any equipment there. He was able to follow the same standardized procedural workflow. And then finally, he was able to come into the skills lab and actually perform it on a task trainer. So again, it doesn't replace the whole continuum, but it taught him enough that when he did come in, borrow faculty time, which is expensive. And we all know there's a backlog of cases because of COVID. There was already a backlog before, it's even greater. So if you're going to take faculty time out of the clinical setting, you want to make sure your learners are at a level where they can benefit, learn more about the art of the delivery of healthcare from those who are seasoned professionals. If you're going to use supplies, consume them in a responsible manner, both from a carbon footprint perspective, but also from just access to this. You know, we saw what happened during COVID when there was a shortage of ventilators. Well, if there were ventilators that are operational and certified to work on a human that were in a skills lab, I'm sure they were pulling those out to put them on the floor because we just need it. It's a life or death situation. So the more you can deliver virtually and then shorten that hands-on, real-time, real faculty, I think is in all of our interest. And also, it's digital. So there's data that can be collected, which is important.
That was my next question is how is this, the effectiveness of this measured? Is there some form of gamification in a sense that allows someone to reach a certain level of certification to where they can then move on to, okay, you've mastered this, now you move here? and here and here, and it's sort of a step function improvement to the point of where you're able to augment what you're doing in real life with VR, and it all kind of seamlessly comes together.
Absolutely. So I can think of a few examples right off the bat. So I had mentioned earlier some of these bigger physical simulators.
Yeah.
So one of them that was developed by Symbionics that is used for credentialing for the fundamentals of endoscopic surgery. So yes, you can, learn, maybe handle the scope in a real patient case for certain steps of it, maybe in an animal lab or in another model, but now you actually have to take a high stakes exam on that platform to show a level of competency before you can really be certified to go out and do that. There are other mechanisms. So at Vantari, we were very fortunate and feel humbled to have announced last fall that we've partnered now with a company, an organization called Intellios. So Intellios actually not only educates, but certifies sonographers in up to 70 countries. So we're going to be developing content that they're going to be able to use for the delivery of workshops, but then also have specific modules they'll use for certification of sonographers. So I think that these different types of technologies play a really important hand now in not only offering practice, but also some level of credentialing. We also saw that when I was at CAE. There was the opportunity to develop something called SimStat, which was screen-based simulation specifically geared to anesthesiologists. Every so many years, they need to participate in certain types of activities to maintain their license, the maintenance of certification in anesthesia, and there's different ways they can go about it. But often they would have to travel to a designated and approved center. They would have to pay over $1,000 to participate in a 2-day course, hands-on, be assessed to get these credits. Well, suddenly the American Society of Anesthesiologists collaborated with CAE and they developed screen-based simulation where you could pay for an access to this, and then you can actually demonstrate your proficiency and competency in a screen-based environment based on a number of different scenarios and actually achieve the same amount of credits towards your maintenance of certification as historically you would have had to have done by traveling to that center. And I think if COVID allowed us to all appreciate something, which was time with family, quality of life impact, and the ability now to do this when it's convenient for you in your home office or your living room in the evening, rather than take away time from your family, travel somewhere at an additional travel and leisure expense to your hospital, maybe to yourself individually, it offered more flexibility. So these are like a number of different ways that the technology has evolved to allow those to credential, maintain credentialing. I think we're still perhaps in some ways a little bit off from where aviation is, which is often the comparison when it comes to medicine. At Vantari, we talk about being the kind of the aviation simulation in healthcare, the plane simulator for healthcare. In aviation, it's mandatory. A pilot must go back every 6 months to kind of renew it by demonstrating competency in a flight simulator based on that type of aircraft they're approved. But that's the law. Right now, it's not the same in healthcare. I think for all of us as potential patients, we hope it'll get to that.
But where do you see, from a risk mitigation standpoint, I mean, do you see that as being something that could potentially come down the line that could eventually maybe even save lives as a result of, I'll just call it, raising the standards?
100%. And there have been some really nice examples of that. So one of them was a hospital or health system on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest. They had a number of incidents every year where they were getting an infection at the site of the placement of a central line. The patient would pass. The payout to the family was around $1 million, and they would have 2 or 3 of these a year. Well, they were able to identify the root cause being site infection, and they recognized that if we can have those putting in central lines use ultrasound to guide where the needle goes, so you're not stabbing multiple times to get access, but rather guide it very specifically. They implemented a program at a cost of $250,000. Anybody that was putting in central lines was asked to go through that to be, if you will, certified or credentialed to do it using ultrasound. And unless there was a mitigating factor that wouldn't allow you to use the ultrasound, that was the way to go. And they went from 2 or 3 cases a year to 0, just because they were identifying a need. They addressed it by developing a curriculum. They used simulation to put those through their paces to ensure those delivering the care were doing it in a more effective, and in that case, reduced infection type approach. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. As more and more data is collected, as health systems want to be as profitable as possible, there are ways to identify what are those adverse events that are happening?
Yeah.
Is it systemic? Is it a technical deficiency? Is that there's new technologies we're just not leveraging that we already have purchased? We just haven't applied it in certain areas where we can get more return on that investment, leading to better outcomes, less adverse events. Maybe now we're not gonna have to cover the cost of the entire admission based on one intervention we performed where we could have done it differently and mitigated that adverse event altogether. So I think you will see more of that. And I think really there's opportunity to collaborate, whether we're at Vantari or other companies, to collaborate with your chief quality officers, for example, at some of these health systems, to say, where are you experiencing adverse events? Where is it costing you money? Because, in our case, it's not abnormal for us to develop a procedure specific and bespoke to a hospital client where they say, this is the equipment that we purchase in our facility or our network of facilities. Here is the protocol we want to follow, but we want to have people come through once a year, for example, and demonstrate that they can continue to know how to apply that. And if that equipment should change, we buy new equipment. Well, let's iterate that in the simulation so they can get comfortable with it there and use the platform as an accreditation or a digital logbook to come through once a year and say, Michael, Howard, John Smith have all come through. They've done it maybe 3 times in a row, gotten 100% to show that it wasn't a one-off fluke. And okay, let's let them continue to do that. And I think you'll probably see more of that.
Well, you mentioned around the changing of equipment. Talk about how you collaborate with manufacturers, with other folks within the ecosystem that are touching, the perioperative, the OR space. How do you work with them?
Absolutely. So there's really two different clients that we work with when we engage with an industry partner. And we engage at Vantari with both pharma companies, but also with medical device, and I'd say more heavily with medical device. So when a medical device company develops a new technology, they first need to train their own staff. They need to train the clinical educators, but they also need to train the salespeople, the marketers, how to go out there and not only demonstrate it to potential buyers, to support them in cases, to give them some guidance on the safe use of the technology. And the way that had traditionally been done was a very expensive, non-scalable approach. So one of our partners that I worked with at another company I was at, their office, for example, in the Middle East region in North Africa, would bring key physicians from that region to Switzerland, where they had a major training facility. This was done, first-class travel, 5-star hotels. I could only bring perhaps one physician from each of these key hospitals, but they're not the only ones using that equipment. So that wasn't scalable. So how do you bring the training to the physician in a way where maybe not everybody's there available today, some will be available tomorrow? Well, again, if I'm using animals, cadavers, that's not, again, a scalable type solution.
That's
So
right.
what we'll do is we'll do a few things. One, we'll work with them to understand what are your training objectives, first and foremost, because we want to be able to benchmark that at the end. Second, our environment is what's called a physics-based environment, meaning that if I'm holding a catheter, whatever it is, and it's floppy, it should behave the same way in the simulation. So we will get a sample of that device, we'll model it so it behaves similarly within the VR space. And what we'll often do is create 2 different types of modules for the learner. One is just becoming familiar with the device. So if it is a steerable device, there's often some novel ways that you manipulate the handle in order to get an effect at the distal tip. So how do I actually interact with the technology? Maybe there's a tablet with some kind of software interface that I also have to know what to look for in terms of the data it's providing, maybe interact with it to enable some form of the technology. So we will build that experience for them that will take the learner through step-by-step on how to become familiar with the technology. That same exact tutorial can be used at conferences, which we've done many times, where it's a draw in the booth to bring in physicians. What are you showing there with the VR headset?
Yeah.
So to try to get them excited about the technology and the means being used by that partner to deliver the training. The other side is those who are going to use the technology for the delivery of care. So like I mentioned, historically, you would have to bring them to a specific location because of the medium of training modality that you'd want to use. But now you can bring the training to them. In our case, all we need access to is a power outlet. So imagine being able to use any conference room. You can go and set up multiple stations. Each learner can come in, take a quick tutorial on how to use the controllers, especially if they're not from the kind of the more recent gaming generations.
Yep.
And I'd say more and more, it has been something. Like I'm approaching 50, but I've been using gaming at some level or not, from Sega and original Nintendos and Atari
Yes.
and all that, for like 35, I would say almost 40 years now. So, it's our generation who are now becoming chiefs of departments and soon will be chairs of departments. And the learners and the students below them have grown up totally native to this type of technology.
Well, listen, we're not necessarily tech savvy leaders, rather tech dependent. You grew up with a smartphone. Innovation isn't just a nice to have anymore; it's a must have. So the the shift that you're starting to see of these leaders that you mentioned that are coming into these very influential positions, I think that's where you're going to start to see um, just the flywheel start to really bend and move, because this isn't something new. This is like, oh, I've been doing this since I was a kid. I've been using VR goggles since I was a kid, and this is just normal. It's
That's right.
typical.
And also, I think COVID changed a lot. COVID changed a lot in a number of ways. One was just access to faculty. They were being used to deliver essential care when there was a shortage of staff, so people asked to do things that they hadn't done maybe since their residency years earlier when they rotated through for a month or two,
Yeah.
something like that. So there suddenly was this deficit of clinical exposure to certain types of procedures. How do you backfill that? How do you backfill it if you literally can't go into the training center because it's closed because of infection prevention or infection control? Well, now you have things that you can maybe just show up with a mask on, check out. Your faculty is there. You can even just share it via something like a Zoom meeting where my faculty can log in remotely, watch me do it, coach me virtually, give me the art of the delivery of healthcare, some tips and pearls of wisdom. So that's becoming, another opportunity when you aren't getting that same clinical exposure. But they're not adding years on to residency. You're still graduating when you were set to graduate.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
now maybe you haven't had the same amount of clinical exposure to certain procedures, and now you're expected to teach others, and people are looking to you for guidance. So I think there are these different opportunities, and just to wrap up on the training side, before you would have multiple clinical educators from a device company, each spending time with each clinician at a workshop. Well, what if you can have one clinical educator circulating amongst 4 stations, because each learner is following the same protocol at their own pace, so self-paced learning. And if they have a question, just raise your hand. And Michael can cover these 4 stations and Howard 4 more. Now we're 2 people training 8, whereas before I needed 8 educators. So, and then beyond that, maybe there's a request of, this was great. I feel much better that you were here. I'd like to practice a little bit more. It's going to be a week or 2 till I have that first case booked with that new novel balloon, valve, whatever it is. Let's say if it's in an endovascular. Well, it's very easy to leave this kind of platform behind and say, no problem. You want to take it home with you in the evening and practice a few hours, an hour in the evening for the next week. It's also allowed to remove that notion of de-skilling. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. Well,
Right. That's right.
and that's the core of our whole mission. It's very personal to us at Vantari because one of our founders had to wait a few years just to get a seat for a surgical airway workshop. Super excited when he got the phone call, you've been accepted. It was with an anesthetized sheep, so very high fidelity. Took the weekend course, got the pretty piece of paper saying he was good to go, then had to wait over 2 years for the opportunity to actually perform it. And this was a surgical airway. So, imagine the stress and the trauma of,
Yes.
I haven't had a chance to practice this, never mind perform it.
Yeah.
Now, if
It's
I
been
don't,
2 years.
I mean, talking about de-skilling, and then in his case, his senior physician wasn't available. He was far from the hospital. He referred some YouTube videos for him to watch, and thankfully he was able to refresh himself as best as he could and still perform it with a good outcome. But it was a traumatizing experience for him. So imagine if
Wow.
you can at least use something like VR to practice something that's a low frequency but high impact event. That's why mass casualty drills are so important, because you may never face a school shooter or a bird strike in that engine, but you better know how to put that plane down on water as a last resort, or run into that building and know how to start delivering first aid to shot students if God forbid that happens. You don't want that learning experience to happen at the moment of reality. So I think these are all different areas where platforms like VR can offer an opportunity to address de-skilling and just keeping people sharp for when they're called upon.
So speaking of landing the plane, let's land the plane here. How do people follow your work, the work of Vantari? and give us a little bit of a commercial as to how we can kind of stay tuned. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna have a little surprise. So tell the members what you're gonna tell them.
Absolutely. So you can always follow us at vantarivr.com through all your regular social media channels. We try to post regularly on platforms like LinkedIn. We're a rapidly growing company, so we're often trying to post, whether it's for new hires as we grow the team globally, new partnerships, whether they be with industry or organizations like Intelios and others. And you can follow any of us individually and collectively through Vantari VR on those different types of platforms, or at a lot of major congresses where we try to be present, both supporting workshops, exhibiting, and also being in partner booths. So whether it be in those four domains, anesthesia, critical care, intensive care, emergency medicine, and cardiology, you'll often find us exhibiting there and showcasing our latest technology.
Howard, that was awesome. So cool. What I did was I was thinking like, what if we could have like a virtual reality meeting? So I was like gonna put my goggles on and maybe you can put your headset on and we can like, do our virtual reality meeting together.
I think this could be the way of the way of the future.
Yeah, this will be the way of the future. We could like shake each other's hands and it'll be really fun. So
Absolutely.
uh anyway, that was really cool. For those of you that have tuned in, if you found this particular conversation enlightening, useful, would you mind just commenting and sharing and just even putting it across your feed? What was the thing that stuck out to you most? And as being a community of innovators, it's about doing. So Howard, I just want to say thanks for what you've been doing. You've been educating, you've been enlightening, and you've been entertaining. So I'm looking forward to future conversations with you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate this opportunity on behalf of myself and Ventari. And for those out there, definitely follow along to the podcast because there's always great and innovative information to learn from. So thank you again for this opportunity.